Okay, ready as I'll ever be, I suppose. I do want to talk to you today about a strange period in philosophical history. We tend to think about philosophical history as if it's, I guess we think this way about scientific history as well, cultural history, as if it's just sort of steady. That is, as if the amount of things sort of happening on the cultural timeline sort of stay mostly steady, and that the character of what's going on stays steady as the different periods roll in and out. Philosophy, as with literature, as with art, and a lot of other things, is nothing like that, really. And one metaphor that I talk about is the sort of flower on the vine. Every now and then, culture, different kinds of factors, economic factors, demographic factors, historical factors come together, and you get something that's unique. And sometimes you get these amazing flowerings of civilization. What's happening in the 1600s, the 17th century, is a scientific revolution that is causing the philosophers, the intellectual classes of Europe to question some very basic things. They really are in a confrontation. So I'm going to talk today about 17th century rationalism and what that means for philosophy of mind. Of course, you're seeing this because you're in my philosophy of psychology class. I'm making this little video for the philosophy of psychology class. Oh, let me put that thing up there then, make that full screen for you there. That's much better, sorry. All right, 17th century rationalism, God, nature, and mind. Let me turn to the, go on to the next slide to keep talking about that. Actually, let me step out for a second and talk about this. So you have the 1600s. Who are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about some familiar names. We're going to talk about Descartes. We're talking about Spinoza and Leibniz. We're going to talk about philosopher Malabranche, who's maybe not as well known to our audience, but would be there with Descartes. We go Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, Leibniz, basically, is what we're going to talk about today. The 17th century rationalists, 1600s, again, you have a scientific revolution going on there. I'm going to talk about that when we go back to the slide in a second. Sometimes people will say about philosophers of this century, this is the century of Galileo, by the way, and his trial by the Inquisition. This is the century that ends with Isaac Newton's Principia, and I am going to talk about that as in the next slide. So sometimes when people talk about the philosophers of the 17th century, Descartes and the rest, what we hear is that, well, they didn't really believe in God. They just had to sort of talk about God because they were worried about the Inquisition. They did have various kinds of worries about the authorities, unless they were fortunate enough to live in Holland during that century, like Spinoza, in which case they could say pretty much whatever they wanted. Oh, you tell Spinoza that. But for what I want to say here is that, do they believe in God or not? Yes, they do. But they are philosophers in a transitional phase. And philosophers, ever since the ancient Greeks and all out across the rest of the world as well, philosophers have a certain way of talking about God that might sometimes be sort of technical. All right, so let's get back to our sharing and let's talk about this scientific revolution. We want to see what the context was for some of these actually fairly wild things when we talk about the philosophy of mind of 17th century rationalism. Some of it's pretty far out, and that's one of the reasons why I like to cover it, because I think it's interesting that way. But we want to look at it in the context of this really amazing 17th century, the 1600s, where you have an incredible scientific revolution, mostly driven by astronomy. Astronomy is to the 17th century what biology, evolution, say, is to the 19th century, or quantum physics is to the 20th century. In the 17th century, the 1600s, everyone's talking about the astronomers and what the astronomers are showing, and the astronomers are making points about the world in general, points that are picked up by the rest of the scientific and intellectual community, including Newton. So there are a whole lot of really interesting astronomers. The history of astronomy in the 17th century is a great example of what I started out talking about, that you don't have any kind of sort of even distribution at all. You have an amazing flowering of astronomy and an unbelievable changing of our perspective of where we were in the universe during the 17th century. The big star there is Galileo. He was the one who first started to use the telescope in a systematic way. He discovered multiple planets around Jupiter. Imagine that. I mean, thinking that you have a sort of seeing what the solar system model was and then seeing a little mini solar system around Jupiter kind of blows people's minds. This is the same time they have lens refraction, and this is the same time that you get microscopes as well. The Dutchman Leeuwenhoek in the century before that, and Galileo also showing microorganisms, worlds upon worlds. Galileo showing that the moon, for example, if he looked at the moon, he saw the craters in the mountains, and it was rugged. And so people had wondered, people thought maybe the celestial bodies were sort of the superlunary bodies, the bodies above the moon, were sort of maybe somehow special, maybe somehow perfect, along sort of old Platonic lines. And Galileo showing that's not true. And of course, notably moving from that geocentric model that said Earth's the center of the universe to, in his case, a heliocentric model. The sun was at the center of the universe, but then that was just an essential step we see now towards the sort of decentered model that we have. One of the really interesting philosophers of that century is Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher, who's very, very early on, very ahead of his time in many ways. Hobbes is reading Galileo, looking at Galileo and the other astronomers of the time, Kepler, for example. And he decides that fundamental ontology, fundamental being, is matter in motion. We think of Hobbes in terms of the social contract argument that we get in the Leviathan. That argument is that people under the rule of law are actually happier, safer, freer. Actually, the key argument is that they're freer than they are under an anarchical situation. And that's because under the rule of law, people are more able to move towards the objects of their desires because people are, after all, matter in motion. And Hobbes also started to take a very materialistic idea towards sort of theorizing about the brain. He thought maybe, every century takes its own technology as the analogy with the brain. Hobbes talked about springs, and maybe memories were spring vibrations, and maybe memory deteriorated the way vibrations will deteriorate in springs, and you had pulleys and winches and things. So the thing about Thomas Hobbes, I think a lot of people don't realize, is that he is in this scientific revolution doing what everybody else does, trying to use the new scientific principles, in his case, to look at studying human beings. And that way he anticipates that Locke and Hume, the great empiricists of the next century. And sort of the culmination then of this movement, and again, coming out of those astronomers, that Isaac Newton says in the Principia in the late 1680s, that you can have sort of mathematical descriptions of the world. That is, Isaac Newton says, for example, what's gravity? Well, he'll give you a mathematical description of the relationship between the distance and the mass and the attraction. And it's one that no matter whether you're talking about two leaves circling each other on a pond or two galaxies circling each other out in the open universe, this is going to be the equation, the proposition that describes the relationship. And so then you get this kind of mechanistic picture that everything's happening by these mechanistic laws, very deterministic. Remember, you have a kind of crude and rude picture of nature in the material world here, not a very nuanced one. And it looks as if it is nature is sort of inert and it's determined like a wind up clockwork watch. The sense of determinism is much more, I think, intuitive and persuasive for people in, say, the 1700s after Newton than it would be, or people looking at the astronomers in the 1600s than it is for us. So sort of setting the stage then for this discussion of the relationship between the mind and the body that these rationalist philosophers had during the 1600s. I do want to say this again. This was a time of extraordinary conceptual transition. So this whole issue of what do they mean by God is, take that very literally. That is, what do you think they mean by it? That bears some thinking. You have Platonic notions, say, of the kind of mathematical or formal order of the universe. But you also have notions about the mind and about movement and about the way that thinking seems to sort of move along, whereas inert matter sort of doesn't. And remember, I'll even step out of this and then we'll come back to talking about the philosopher's God. When you look at the very origins of society, very ancient communities, you tend to find a kind of panpsychism. What's that? What's panpsychism? The idea that there are spirits in all of the things, in the clouds, in the plants, in this and in that. How does that help? Well, what you're trying to do is think about the motives, so that is the psychology of everything. And why is that characteristic of ancient societies rather than ordinary physical causation? Well, because the first causation that we know about is psychological causation. That is, we understand our own behavior in terms of our beliefs and desires and hopes and fears and so on. So if we're first starting to think about causation, it's just very natural to think that causation has to do with these intentional states. And what panpsychism sort of is imbuing the world with these kinds of intentional states. So a very old kind of attitude is a certain version of panpsychism. Right. So bearing that in mind, we think about what these philosophers of the 1600s were up against. Sincere believers in God, but also people doing metaphysics and logic and philosophy who would sometimes use God. This is what we say the philosopher's God. Philosophers will start to talk about, well, can an omniscient being be said to do anything? Or if a being is not located in time, then what's the theory of time for that being? And, getting into metaphysical issues that are suggested by the way that we talk about God. But sometimes it will take us pretty far afield from what most ordinary folks would mean by talking about God. Of course, whenever any two people are talking about God, we have a problem about defining our terms, though, don't we? Which is the thing, which is why it doesn't work on social media, because you say, well, God, what do you mean by God? And that's the end of that. In any event, these people were aware in the 1600s of the issue that, for example, Kant is confronting 100 years later in the late 1700s, that is, that science seems to offer us a kind of amoral, kind of godless perspective on a world that doesn't seem to have a God or morality in it. But also notice that new science, for that matter, couldn't explain why life was there. I mean, it had a mechanistic sort of picture of matter. And so how is it that life? In fact, that discussion, the idea that you could have all of the physical description and explanation that you wanted, but you still weren't going to be able to explain how things were alive. That discussion was alive and well, if you'll pardon the pun, up into the 19th century, up into the 1800s. Until the intellectual history story is that finally organic chemistry got good enough that people just sort of thought it was okay. I'm not sure if I can defend that all the way down to the ground, but there, you see the picture. So you have a mix here. They are sincere when they talk about God, but like all philosophers, they sometimes are using the term God as a term of art, meaning something technical by it. And a lot of this was motivated in that last bullet point there by this mechanistic sort of Newtonian picture of matter as being kind of mindless and inert. So that's a big part of what they're wrestling with here. Okay, so just running then through, I'm going to run through those four I mentioned. That is Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, and Leibniz. Descartes really gives a problem. Descartes, for all his fame, doesn't really come up with a lot that's not sort of traditional. He thinks he can prove the existence of God. He thinks he can show that the mind and the body are two different substances. Very briefly, the way that Descartes is going to argue that the mind and the body are two different, the real argument, as far as I can see, is that I can doubt the evidence of my senses, and all of the physical world seems to be brought to me through my senses, whereas I can't doubt the mental, since I know that whether what I'm thinking is correct or not, there is something that's thinking. So that means that the mental is somehow indubitable. It's something that cannot be doubted, whereas all of the physical, since he thinks that all the evidence for the physical world can be doubted, it is dubitable. And that means they don't have the same property. So actually, that's the argument. Woo! But what is the argument again? Well, two things don't have the same property. They're not identical. And mental life has the property of being indubitable. We can't doubt that there's something that's thinking right now. But everything that we experience with our senses looks like it's something we can doubt, according to Descartes. That's the argument. Mind-body dualism. So Descartes said, look, really in Descartes' ontology, there are three things. There's material substance and mental substance, and then there is God. So really there are three things in terms of Descartes' ontology. Your ontology, among other things, there's going to be a number of things in your ontology. Anyone who only has one thing in their ontology is going to be a monist, whether that one thing is mind or matter or God, by the way, and there are versions of all three. And anyone who has two or more things in their ontology, we're going to call a dualist, including Descartes, who, as I just said, has three things: mind, matter, and God. So he gave that argument that I just explained to you in the first bullet point there in the Meditation 1641. The problem is this is interaction. Let me step out of that just for a second. So once again, compare the problem of mental causation for people in the beginning of the 21st century to the problem of mental causation for people in the 17th century. In the 17th century, if you just assumed, like Descartes did, well, if you took it as shown, that the mind and the body were just completely metaphysically distinct from each other, and that the physical things had no mental properties, and the mental things had no physical properties, including no extension in space, or any of the other kinds of properties, such as mass or velocity or anything else that we usually think of in terms of our causal descriptions of physical things interacting. So the problem of mental causation for someone in the 17th century was, the problem of how does Casper the Friendly Ghost open the door? I mean, how can a non-physical thing have causal interactions with the physical thing? Straight up metaphysical problem. In the 21st century, we have a problem of mental causation. It's just, it doesn't look like it's exactly the same kind of problem. Briefly, the problem today is it doesn't look as if the physical description of what's going on inside the body gives us what we need in terms of the semantic content of the belief, which looks like it's actually playing the causal role in production behavior. But that's getting a little far afield. Let me go back to our slide here. So Descartes has this interaction problem. How is it that physical things and non-physical things interact? He had some fairly cockamamie theories about that, with all due respect. But a lot of people in his time didn't necessarily think that that was something that they want to do. All these people are concerned about science and the practice of science, and mostly they're concerned about it in a positive way. They're trying to sort of help clear the way. Again, what looks to us to be fairly far-fetched ideas, from their perspective, it was sort of conceptual analysis and looking at the concepts that they had to work with and figuring out how to square those with some of this new information that was rushing in on them from the scientists. I mean, they're all together. They don't see them. René Descartes was a mathematician. Leibniz was a scientist. If you want, he was an engineer. I mean, these people don't see themselves as philosophers as distinct from other people. So one thing to do is to say, well, look, there isn't really any physical causation at all. I mean, all the causation is really divine causation, or maybe mental causation. I mean, if everything's mental, then the only causation is mental causation. So if you have a problem with one kind of causation, I mean, if you don't like divine causation, if you don't like God causing things, you can swap that out for physical causation. I mean, you can choose your theory of causation, I guess. My method is to try and figure out which one I think is true, but whatever. So they get into this larger discussion about causation, because you've got now the new natural causation, these physical causal stories that the new scientists are telling. And then you've got traditional causation, creationist stories, and other theological stories about God having a causal role in things. And they have a problem that we don't really have. I mean, if we care about this at all, we people 21st century tend to think, well, okay, well, maybe God created everything in the first place, or maybe God ambiently continues to make it possible that everything exists. But then within that context, you get the physical causation, the local causation of physical objects. So, for example, I might say, well, evolution is no objection. Evolution doesn't contradict theism in any way. If God just set the chain of events happening, it's amazingly creative and productive. It seems to me even better than just creating a static world. But the reason that, again, that I mentioned that is just to talk about this issue about the relationship between different kinds of causation. And we have three: divine causation, mental causation, and physical causation. Descartes and most of these people, see, the thing is, they're not happy with just sort of saying it's divine causation on Sunday and physical causation Saturday through, Monday through Saturday. I mean, we think, okay, sure. I mean, come on, with a nudge and a wink, but that wasn't good enough for them. So Malabranche, then, I mentioned him a couple times. He's significant if we're into this topic, because he really nailed down that position. He saw that really what he wanted to say was, no, the only causal agent is God. Notice that's kind of in your face to the new science. Malebranche was a cleric, and he was, of all of these people, the least sympathetic to the new science, I think. Not that he would have said he was unsympathetic, but he did want to nail down that. And again, you think, well, a theist today could say, well, sure, okay, everything's caused by God, but then you have science doing its thing in this world that's caused by God. But Malebranche he didn't think that would work. He wasn't satisfied with that. So that's the second bullet point there. He thought, well, let's look at the last three bullet points, because these are actually sort of arguments. He thought that matter as defined by Descartes as having the property of extension was then entirely passive and couldn't be the cause of anything. He also, with the Dutchman, Gillens, I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, made what is an interesting argument, I think. I'm not exactly sure what to make of it, but it makes me think. They said, well, look, you say that your behavior is intentional because it's a product of your beliefs and desires. That is, you say it's volitional. You're willing yourself to do the things that you're doing. But in order for me to do something, I have to know how to do it. But I don't know how my body moves. I don't know how my arm moves. I don't know how to make my body move. I don't understand anything about it at all. So how can it be said that I'm doing it when I don't even know how it works or what's going on? Again, I don't know exactly what to make of that argument, but it's kind of an interesting argument. And then the last bullet point there is the constant creation argument. That is, one way of looking at things would be to say that God created the world, and then the world's running its course on its own. Like, God turns on the machine and then leaves. But another argument is that God is constantly creating the world. And and then the argument here is that if God's constantly creating the world, then you can't say that there's some sort of material or physical causal relationship between something that happened a minute ago and something that's happening now, because this moment doesn't have anything to do with that moment, since they're both just creations of God, something like that. So that's weird enough. But then along comes Spinoza. Spinoza had a hard life. He was very much an independent thinker, and he very much paid the price for it. But in any event, thinking, I guess what we want to think about in terms of Spinoza today is this question about the relationship between God and matter. And you can also think about it as a relationship between mathematics and matter, between logic and matter. And in that sense, Plato also understood this problem and saw this issue. The way Spinoza goes about it is he says this. He says, look, God's infinite. And so since God's infinite, it can't be that any place there's a boundary that has God on one side of the boundary and not God on the other side, because that would be a boundary on God, and God's infinite. So then Spinoza concluded that everything is God. That is, that God is nature. That is, that the natural universe is both the mind and the body of God. There are other people who have said this. There's a Hindu strain that says this. From our point of view, it looks very beautiful because Spinoza makes studying nature into a sacrament, and that'd be nice. And that also reminds us of some our idealizations of some ancient societies, or that one in the movie where all the people are blue. I don't know. You know what I mean? But at the time, of course, that was considered very blasphemous. What Spinoza is doing is trying to think about this relationship between new science and nature. And there's also, I think, in Spinoza, a much older, much more classical question that we find also in the ancient Greeks, which is the question between the relation between nature and mathematics, which is kind of even maybe bigger. Now, one of the things about Spinoza that makes him a player in philosophy of mind today, or of interest to people in philosophy of mind today, is what's called this double aspect theory. So Spinoza says that then, since everything is both the mind and the body of God, then everything can be explained both in terms of mind and body. That is, there's a physical description and a mental description of everything. And for people interested in the mind-body problem, that's attractive, that's intuitively attractive, because when we're thinking about a human being, we think about the physical description of the human being and then the mental description of the human being. And maybe Spinoza's right that somehow we're making a mistake to think that we can have some sort of transformation rules between psychophysical laws, right, between the intentional description and the physical description. So he gets at some conceptual problems that really are still very much at the center of things today. Notice also, though, that this suggests a kind, again, of panpsychism. All of these people, since they, one of the things that's motivating them is to think that it must be that movement in the universe is actually caused by some moral intention, and that's going to be mental. And they are resisting any notion that we're going to be sort of cast off into this world of impersonal causes. Now, and then another thing that Spinoza would say is the world is the mind and the body of God, then that means also that the world is perfect, because the mind of God is perfect and complete. So this universe is also perfect and complete, only we don't realize it. And then somehow Spinoza manages to motivate a very interesting question of human motives and human responsibility from that I can't go into right now. What am I doing right now? I'm talking about the mind-body problem. What does Spinoza say? Spinoza says everything is God. Spinoza is a monist. He's an ontological monist. In his ontology, there's only one thing: God. Everything is God. God is nature. We think, as I was saying, it's a good thing maybe to say that God is nature, but at the time people sort of thought that was outrageous, since of course you've got that old Platonic and Christian idea of the duality between the perfect heavenly realm and the fallen earthly realm. And so I think that's what seemed so blasphemous about Spinoza. People thought he was very blasphemous to say such a thing. And as they say, no contingency. Well, Leibniz then, and Leibniz is kind of a strange one, I have to say. But Leibniz thought maybe there has to be some ground level of being, like Democritus thought when he thought there had to be atoms. Only Leibniz sort of thought this had to be mental. This had to be ultimately mental for the same reason, because he thought that things had to be doing something for intentional reasons. But then if Spinoza says there's sort of one mind, one body, one God, one world, somehow, Leibniz reverses that. Leibniz, what's Leibniz's, how many things are in Leibniz's ontology? Actually, there's perhaps an infinite number of things in Leibniz's ontology, which makes him a dualist, by the way, because that means that's more than one. Leibniz says that fundamental being are these monads, which are the actual creations of God, and they're essentially mental things. I don't pretend to understand all of that, but the idea then is that there's the way all the clocks in a clock store might all be set at the same time. Leibniz's view is that God has sort of set all of the physical parts of nature all to be coordinated with each other, but the only causal relationship there is God's cause. And then another interesting thing about Leibniz is, remember, Spinoza said the universe is perfect because the universe is the mind and body of God. And Leibniz's problem with that, I mean, there's a problem of moral responsibility. We all have a problem with moral responsibility in Spinoza's universe, because it looks like Spinoza's universe is highly deterministic. It looks like everything in Spinoza's universe could not be otherwise. It's logically necessary, because the physical world and math are both the same thing. You got to decide, are you gonna go after math as not credible or the physical world as not? And in Spinoza's case, he definitely votes for math. That is, the physical world looks to us to be a messy, contingent, probabilistic place, but it's not, according to the 17th century rationalists. It's a strictly determinate place. But Leibniz noticed that the problem with that was then that it looked like God doesn't do anything at all, first of all, let alone create the world. So God isn't really a moral agent, and that does look like a bit of a problem. So Leibniz's response to that was to say that actually God is a moral agent. God chose the best of all possible worlds. And the really clever thing about that is you got a really kind of wild argument. I think students are often aghast when I explain this to them. The best possible world argument means that, say, terrible things happen, like earthquakes and pestilence and so on. You think, well, why is this? Why is God, allowing so much suffering to be in the world? It's the problem of evil. If God is good, how come we suffer in the world? But according to Leibniz, God made the best possible world. It's like, come on, I'm sorry about the earthquake and everything, but it's the best possible world. You can't hold it against God. The interesting relationship there between God and logic. Descartes actually thought that logic depended on God, and that God could just as God could cause the organization of the physical world to come unglued, Descartes thought somehow that that God could cause the necessity of math and logic to somehow come unglued, that God was also holding those things up. And with Leibniz, we get a different kind of approach to modality that is being what's necessary, what's contingent, probable, improbable, and so on. All right, well, I think we might be, So, closing up on that. Now, so every century isn't like this, with this sort of a big slew of these competing, very strange kind of metaphysical theories. These continental rationalists of the 17th century found themselves in a very acute transitional phase where they really had to match up some apparently not very compatible concepts. I would say it is ironic that their commitment to intentional causation, right, versus material versus physical causation, or what we understand by physical or efficient causation, ironically turns these great rationalists into these very sort of atavistic figures who are kind of seeing a mind, in this case one mind, the mind of God, kind of at work in everything that's moving, in the leaf fluttering. For my money, in the 1700s, we got someone like David Hume who's going to start to talk about experience, and experience is still a philosophically strange thing to talk about. David Hume, contrary to what he thinks he might be able to do, does not do away with philosophy of metaphysics by any means. But not only these empiricists, but think of existentialists and others, a big approach in the future would be to embrace this sort of amoral vision and take it from there. Kierkegaard, for heaven's sakes, and Nietzsche are doing that. So rationalism kind of fades away also because what happens at the end of the 1700s is you get Kant, who is trying to be the great synthesizer. I sort of read him as basically a rationalist myself, who wanted to say, look, you have this conceptual scheme, a la Descartes, supposedly put in there by the dictates of transcendental reason, which is actually forming a representation of the world. And that representation of the world, the phenomenal world, the world of experience, is the world of science. But the noumenal world, the world in itself, is the world as it is unmediated by our conceptual structure, our conceptual organization. Which I mention only in context of looking at the 17th century rationalists, because it's a completely different approach. And that sort of inward approach to phenomenology, that is the study of human experience, and the claim that that study will always be something separate from the physical sciences, is a different approach that what we call continental philosophy wanted to maintain an area for philosophy completely independent of the researches of physical science and the perspective of physical science. Turned away from a direct appeal to God for that, and instead moved in this phenomenological Kantian direction. So the point is that these old 17th century rationalists, with all their talk about occasionalism and parallelism and all the rest of it, are that's kind of a lost story. I think it's a good story for us because it exercises our minds in thinking about the relationship between the mind and the body. They had an extraordinary conversation for a while there. So Descartes, Malebranche, and then Spinoza, Leibniz, of course. Then Berkeley, who we usually think of as an empiricist, although I'd say he's kind of a marginal figure there. Berkeley talks about this kind of stuff, but I mentioned a few other people along the way here who are of interest. Okay, so okay, okay, that's fine. So the 17th century rationalists, the discussion of the basic relation about causation, the relation between God and nature in the 1600s, that is revealing. And also, I'll be honest, part of the reason I always like to do it is because I think it's kind of fun too. It's kind of philosophy is literature as well as everything else that it's involved in, including science and psychology. But we can see sometimes, we can appreciate it sometimes, I think, just even for its own sake, when we get this very sort of abstruse content. Anyway, that's the 17th century rationalists.